The hypothesis is the third step of the scientific method. It's basically where you try to answer the question that you did in the first step. So if you start with asking a question, at this point is when you present the possible answer. It is the proposed scientific explanation or the unconfirmed prediction that establishes a relationship between the first independent variable and the second dependent variable. In other words, this is going to be your, based on the inferences, on those educated guesses that you did, where you did your research, your proposed answer for the question that you had. So if science starts with asking questions, hypothesis is where you were attempting to make an answer based on what you've known, what you've researched. And we talked about this on the Nature of Science lecture series, and hopefully you've watched it by now, so you should even know how to set up a good hypothesis. And the whole idea is you're going to start with that whole, the effect of blank on blank, which is the problem statement that we talked about in the first step, or asking the question, and now you're going to change that into this format: if blank, then blank. So basically, if you did the problem statement right, you put the independent variable in the first blank, or the variable that you're going to manipulate or you're going to change, and on the second blank you put the dependent variable or the responding variable that you're going to be measuring. So you put the variable that is the cause and the variable that's the effect on the right place. And if you did that right, you set yourself up to write the good hypothesis, because those variables that you already identified on your problem statement, all you got to do now is do this. On the first blank, you're going to write down what you intend to do to that variable to see what happens to the other variable which you put on the second blank. So basically, if this is done to the independent variable, this will happen to the dependent variable. On the sample that we're doing, we're talking about playing with the acid rain and seeing what will happen to the growth of the tomato plants. So a good variable based on the background that we did is that if the solutions are more acidic, then the plant will grow less, right? So something like that. So you see, it's easy to set up a hypothesis if you did the problem statement right, and if you did your research to understand what the problem statement is all about. So they build on each other. But what's hard about hypothesis writing is that people forget some basic rules, and if you follow these rules, you're going to make great hypotheses. Now, basically, remember that hypothesis sometimes is also grouped with the problem statement and the background in a section that's called the introduction in some scientific papers. And it is very possible to write a good hypothesis without following all of these rules, but I suggest that you try to follow them because it will make a better hypothesis. First of all, just like you're not really supposed to use personal pronouns when you're writing a scientific paper, there is no need to introduce your hypothesis by saying those, middle school things like, oh, my hypothesis is, or I believe that, or I think that, or researchers hypothesize that. There's no need to do that. After you're done discussing your background, you can just go, boom, that's what I think the relationship between the variables are. So I talk about acid rain, I talk about tomatoes, and then I just basically state, the more acidic, the less growth. So it's a simple statement that establishes the relationship. There is no need to introduce it, especially since in my lab report format, you have to put a header anyway that says hypothesis. So it's kind of like idiotic to say header, hypothesis, and then under that it said, my hypothesis is. There's no need for that. Go directly to the hypothesis. Second, it should be a complete but concise statement. Usually if the hypothesis is long and is dragging, it's not a good hypothesis. So that's a good rule of thumb. Keep it short, keep it simple. Third, it should establish a one-to-one relationship between the variables. So that means it needs to be some sort of like if-then statement, or something like the more of this, the less of that, or if you do this, then that happens. You see, it doesn't necessarily have to be an if-then statement. I just like if-then statements because they're easy to set up and to do it right. But you can do some other sort of statement as long as you're establishing a one-to-one relationship between the variables. I can say if there is more acid, then the plants will grow less, or I can say the more acid, the less the plant grows. Either way, I'm establishing a one-to-one directional relationship between the variables, and that is the key. Now here it gets a little more complicated, and one thing you should never do in a hypothesis is add an extra variable or something else that could be affecting the dependent variable that's not exactly what you're testing. In this example that I'm giving here, let's say for example you're studying the effects of wind or like say rain on the erosion. If you talk about both at the same time, now you have two independent variables, and that's a problem. You shouldn't say if there's more wind and rain, then there will be more erosion, because then you can't say was it the wind or was it the rain that did it. It's two independent variables at the same time, and that's, as you should know, in a good experiment you only test one thing at a time. So you shouldn't really have two variables in your hypothesis. You should only establish the relationship between one variable and the other one. Now what I'm about to say goes beyond what you need to know for the purpose of my class, but I like to educate people on the whole of things, and there is an exception for this rule. there is one sort of experimental design. It's like an advanced kind of experiment, which is called a multifactorial design, where you purposely want to examine the effects of multiple variables on a dependent variable. But even then, you're not really doing one experiment with many independent variables. What you're doing is many experiments at the same time, so that you can see the relationships that exist between the independent variables. And this is a little complicated. Remember, I'm not expecting to understand this, but if you're interested in it, you can watch it. Now, basically, the idea here is that let's say, for example, you want to find out the effect of wind on erosion and the effect of rain on erosion, and the relationship that exists between wind and rain and how that affects erosion. You see? Because it may be that there's more erosion if there's more wind. Maybe more erosion if there's more rain, but there's also the fact that wind makes the rain erosion worse. So you see, I want to examine all those relationships, so a multifactorial design is the best thing you can do for that. But in that case, you would not try to make one hypothesis. You would have several, just because you have several variables. So it would be something like, if there's more wind, then there'll be more erosion. If there's more rain, then there'll be more erosion. And then you can also say, if there's more wind, then the rain will cause more erosion. So you see, I'm establishing several hypotheses because I'm doing what is called a multifactorial design. But you more than likely are not going to be doing something like that for this class. And if you do, you have to ask for a lot of help so you do it right. But basically, good typical experiments work at one hypothesis at a time. So you should not have hypotheses with more than one variable at the same time. And even when you do a multifactorial design, you have to do multiple hypotheses because of that. All right. Another important thing is that you're not going to put intermediate variables in your hypothesis. By that, for example, I mean that sometimes there's things that explain why the relationship between the two variables exists. In the example that we've been working on, it's not really the acid that caused the plant to stop growing. You see, the acid is absorbed by the plant, which then destroys the enzymes inside the plant, and then it stops the chemical reactions, and then the plant doesn't grow. You're not going to write all of that in your hypothesis. That belongs in your background, where you explain the relationship that exists in your background. Now, you can get specific on the hypothesis if you want. You can say the last chemical reactions that occurred, the last the plant will grow. But that's not what you set out to study, so that's not really answering your research question that you had at the beginning. And it's okay to leave it general and leave the specifics for a future experiment if that's what you want to do, to study each step of your theory one step at a time. But remember, though, that you should not introduce medium variables. The example that I'm doing here, for example, let's say you want to talk about the fact that the more sunlight, or you want to see the difference between temperature of the day and night. So your hypothesis is like, for example, days are hotter than nights because the sun is hitting the unobstructed ground directly during the day. That's a bad hypothesis because all you need is to say is days are hotter than nights. You explain the rationale for that on your background. Or you do a more specific experiment that talks about the specifics of what you want to talk about. Like, for example, periods with direct unobstructed ground sunlight exposure are hotter than periods without it. But then I'm not comparing day and night directly. That's not exactly the research question I had in the beginning. But it's a different experiment. It's a more specific. And besides, it's a little more complex too. It's good to keep a hypothesis simple. Remember that. But my point here is this. Do not explain the reasoning behind the connection between the variables and the hypothesis. That belongs in the background. Your hypothesis is just setting up the relationship that exists between one variable and the other without adding an extra variable or adding middle ground to explain the connection between them. Just list the connection, list the relationship, and you'll be done. Another problem with the hypothesis that a lot of people do is that they define the variables within the hypothesis. So in the example we just talked about between days and night, you would go on and on and on to say what a day is, and then what a night is, and then what the difference would be in temperature. So you say temperature, what it is. For example, it becomes such a complex hypothesis because you would say like periods with unobstructed sunlight exposure when the sun is out during the day are hotter than periods when the sun is not out and directly hitting the ground. And oh, by the way, I forgot to say that hotness means that there's more molecular movement on the part. What? Before you know it, you're writing a background instead of writing a hypothesis. Just keep it simple and leave all the explanations and definitions of the variables for the background. All the hypothesis does is it sets up the relationship between those variables, but you explain them in the background. Keep it simple. There's no need to define the variables within the hypothesis. And lastly, Another thing too is that a good hypothesis establishes a clear order of success between all groups which are being examined in the experiment. Like we talked about before, sometimes you have multiple groups in the experiment. Sometimes you have a little more acid, a little more acid, a little more acid. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to find out if an athlete that works out longer, practices longer, will actually end up running faster than another one. And so I say, oh yes, let's say I'm going to see like no training, 10 hours and 20 hours of training. And then I say, my hypothesis would be like, athletes' speed will be best after 20 hours of training. Is that a good hypothesis? Well, it may seem like it is because you think in your head, the more training, the faster this guy is going to run. But this might be true, or it might not be true. What if too much training actually causes the athlete to hurt himself or something like that, or overdo it? Or what if the batter is in the middle? And even if 20 hours of training is better, which one is second place? Is it the 10-hour or is it no training? So you see, a good hypothesis establishes a relationship that works in all the groups. So, if you said leave the hypothesis the way it is here, that's saying athletes will be best at 20 hours of training, you're not describing what happens between the 10 and the 0 training. A better hypothesis would be like, if training time increases, then the athlete's speed also increases. Because this will serve as a predictor that explains the relationship across all groups. And if it was the case that 10 hours would be the ideal, you could always say athlete speed increases up to an optimal number of 10 hours, after which it decreases. So you see how I'm establishing the relationship that exists between the variables. And that will be ideal. So sometimes, though, it gets complicated to do this because sometimes you have multiple groups and it's really hard to put it all together. Let's say, for example, you have 3 schools and each one of them is trying a different kind of educational program. And then you want to find out which program is best for the kids. Is it program A, is it B, or is it C? Now, since this is not a numerical thing, it's not like 0, 10, and 20, it's hard to set up a ratio like we did in the example before. So this time it's harder. So I can do 2 things. Either I can do several hypotheses to establish the scenario, or I can try to group them in a complex hypothesis. Now I'll show you what I mean here. I can do like this. If I think that A is going to be the best one, I can say, educational program A will improve the student scores the most. That's one hypothesis. Then I do a different hypothesis. Educational program B will improve the scores more than education program C. And that way I establish a ranking by doing 2 hypotheses at once. But you may want to have only one hypothesis on your experiment. So how would you do that? You could say that the school's performance will be in the following ranked order. A, then B, then C. So there you go. You establish the rank on your hypothesis. So you see, it's not every hypothesis that can be an if-then statement because of these kinds of things. But if you keep your design simple, you get away from these problems at all. But I like to talk about the exceptions because, they come up. The last thing I want to talk about how to write a good hypothesis is that it needs to be a testable statement. What that means is that it's got to be falsifiable. There's got to be a chance that this thing is going to fail. If you say something like, eating rice ultimately causes death. Did you know that? Did you know that rice is deadly? If you eat rice, you will die. Did you know that? Well, it's of course, because everybody in history who has eaten rice ultimately ended up dying. Because everybody dies, right? But that means the hypothesis is stupid. It can't be denied. So what's the point of that? A hypothesis must have a chance of being falsifiable. Remember, science sets out to disprove things, not to prove things. And then along the lines, the same line, you got to have in the hypothesis some indication of how you're going to be measuring and changing these things. So for example, let's say you're trying to see if kids that study more do better in tests. It's bad. Look at this hypothesis. Bad kids are less intelligent. That's a terrible hypothesis. First, because I have no idea what you mean by bad kids. And second, I have no idea what you mean by less intelligent. Now, I'm not asking you to define the variables here. I'm asking you to at least give me some indication of how you're going to be measuring them. For example, look at the difference. I could say kids who study less perform worse in tests. So you see there? I know what my independent variable is. It's talking about studying. And my dependent variable it's talking about test performance. This is called operationalizing the variables. An operational definition is when you put in your hypothesis writing that suggests exactly how you're going to be measuring things.